in 1891 for the Surrey, Sussex, and Southampton. It sounds English, but it isn't. That was the name of 3 counties in Virginia that was serviced by this railroad, and they were named after English counties. And it stayed there until the road folded up in the 30s, and then it was bought up by Argent Lumber, the people that we got it from. The 2 was built for a land development and logging company called New Berlin and Winfield, and the same thing happened when the railroad it originally worked on was abandoned. Then it was bought up by the loggers. And this is all Tidewater cypress. Most all of the track was built on trestles. It was cypress. It was swamp area. And they negotiated this rough track work on a trestle. When they needed water, they'd drop a hose down in the swamp and suck a tank full of water from the swamp. Crawfish, minnows, and everything, you know. When we got the engines back here, we found about 6 inches of sand and gravel in the bottom of them, you know, just mud from the swamp. You know. The next big thing was 1966, the acquisition of the Big Shay. That was the talk of the railroad for some time, an 80-ton engine. Of course, it forced us to completely rebuild all the track. It just wasn't, the track wasn't built to handle an 80-ton engine. It's the biggest piece of machinery by 3 or 4 times of anything on the grounds. You know, just sheer weight, sheer size, plus the fact it's different. It is a logger with a 3-cylinder vertical engine on the side. Most of the people come to old thrashers, even the old-timers that have seen locomotives all their life and never seen a Shay because they were not indigenous to this area. They were in logging country. That's where they were used. And from the exhaust, when you hear them run, they sound like they're moving 60 miles an hour and they're moving about 10 miles an hour. They're geared down real slow for lots of pulling power and tight curves and rough track, steep grades. They're powerful, but not fast.
Most of our locomotives, when they were operating in their day, were used as logging locomotives. Our number 2 and our number 6 came from the last place they were at was Hardyville, South Carolina. They were in the cypress swamps logging down there. And the number 9 came from Northern California, Tuolumne, California. It belonged to Westside Lumber Company, which had quite an extensive railroad running through the mountains of Northern California. It operated along with several other locomotives of this same type and class, hauling logs down out of the hills to the ponds, or to the mills and the mill ponds. Our number 1 came originally from Mexico. It was built in Philadelphia, but it came from Mexico. And we're not too clear on the history of that. We think it may have been a coal hauler at one time. And what does that leave? That leaves our Henschel. That would have been used basically as a switching locomotive, an industrial type locomotive somewhere in Germany.
They were brought over here in 1963, brought over here from Germany for a new theme park that was going to be built in Detroit. But something happened in the plans and it never was built. And these engines both sat in a salvage yard for 20 years before we got them. And of course they were both badly weathered in 20 years. And we have the 16 restored to full operation, and the 4 is still waiting to be restored. But we're no rush on the 4 because it's a twin sister to the 16, and we already have one example of it running, so it's on the bottom of the totem pole, you know.
Each locomotive is like a truck or a car. It's designed for a certain purpose, actually. The German locomotive was built to switch in a yard, so it's not a comfortable locomotive to run for a long period of time. You don't even sit in it. There's not even a box to sit on. So it was expected you stood your 8-hour shift and you switched, and that way you were careful and you're leaning out the doors. It's built so you can see well. It does have some European things that the Americans didn't get into. The whole firebox in the German locomotives copper, which is something that the Americans never did, and just about all the European countries did that with steam locomotives and were real comfortable, and it was real safe for them. The big reason for that being that the firebox is one of the places that rots in a steam locomotive first, where all the mud and the lime and everything settle. Copper won't deteriorate. Number 6, which was a locomotive that hauled wood all its life, and it's just basically the average locomotive. It very functional and fairly small as far as the average locomotives go, but narrow gauge, that's the reason they did that. They would go on lighter ties and less track work and that kind of a thing, so that was the advantage. And get around a sharper corner, that was a big thing. 9 come out of the Sierras. It was a logging locomotive. A Shea-style locomotive is built to climb better than a 15% grade, which is pretty impressive for steam, because a side rod locomotive, 4% grade is considered fairly heavy. So although it's very slow, it can go up a very steep climb, and that's what they did with the mountains when they were logging the pine trees with it. It was up and down steep grades all day long, so each one of them functions in a different manner.
Although the Midwest Central has several different types of locomotives, each unique in its own individual way, the basic process of steam operation, from steam generation to steam consumption, is pretty much the same.
Basically, there is a fire inside of a contained box. The heat from this fire is transferred through a series of pipes and through the surface area of the box into the water, which creates steam, which is an expansive gas, which means it has energy stored in it. And then that steam is channeled through a control valve known as the throttle to your cylinders, which steam is emitted first to one side, then to the other side, and it pushes the cylinder back and forth through a series of control valves. And then that motion is through all the rods on the side of the locomotive is transferred into forward motion, and turning of the wheels.
Now there was different types of steam locomotives. There was what we call saturated steam locomotive, which all that did was just run on the steam out of the boiler itself. And then we have what we call superheated steam, which what that does is the steam as it comes out of the boiler goes through another heater at the very front end of the smoke box and gets reheated again before it goes into the engine itself.
Saturated steam is steam that is taken under pressure directly off of the water inside the pressure vessel, and which is channeled through the throttle, down the dry pipe, into the headers, and into the cylinders. Now superheated steam starts out the same way. It runs in through the throttle